Ayla's hand froze on the door handle when she heard Nathaniel's voice through the glass, low and intimate in a way she'd never heard before. "Sarah, you know I can't keep doing this." The storm outside rattled the lodge windows as she watched. Her boss leaned against his desk, phone pressed to his ear. Completely unaware of her presence in the darkened hallway, she should have walked away, should have pretended she never heard the conversation that would change everything between them. Instead, she found herself rooted to the spot, watching the man who commanded boardrooms with ruthless precision look more vulnerable than she'd ever imagined possible. The weekend had been a disaster from the start. The company retreat was supposed to be a celebration. Blackstone Creative had just landed the Morrison account, their biggest client to date. But when the presentation files corrupted 30 minutes before the pitch, chaos erupted. While everyone else panicked, Ayla had calmly rebuilt the entire campaign from memory, her fingers flying across her laptop as she reconstructed months of work in record time. Nathaniel had watched her work with an intensity that made her skin prickle when she finished, saving not just the account, but the agency's reputation. He'd simply nodded and said, "Impressive, Morgan." But his eyes had held something deeper: recognition, maybe even respect. Now, listening to his conversation, she realized there was so much more beneath his carefully constructed facade. "I know what we agreed," he continued into the phone, running his free hand through his dark hair. "But Emma wouldn't want this. She'd want me to move on, to stop punishing myself for surviving when she didn't." Emma, his late wife. Ayla had heard whispers about the car accident 3 years ago, but Nathaniel never spoke about his personal life. The company knew him as a brilliant strategist who'd built Blackstone from nothing, but the man on the phone sounded broken, haunted by ghosts she couldn't see. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. The phone call ended abruptly as Nathaniel noticed her reflection in the window. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a moment, neither moved. Then he was walking toward the door, his expression shifting back to the controlled mask she knew so well. "The others left for the city before the storm hit," he said as he opened the door, his voice carefully neutral. "Roads washed out. We're stuck here until morning." Ayla nodded, acutely aware of how the lodge suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. "I was just looking for coffee. I know you always work late when you're processing." He stepped aside to let her pass, and she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and subtle that she'd never noticed in the sterile office environment. The lodge's main room was cozy, all exposed beams and stone fireplace. Emergency lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls as the power flickered again. Nathaniel moved to the bar in the corner, his movements efficient and practiced. "Whiskey?" he offered, already pouring to glasses. "I think we've both earned it after today." She should have said no, should have made an excuse and retreated to her room. Instead, she found herself accepting the glass, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch was electric, unexpected, sending heat racing up her arm. "You saved us today," he said, raising his glass in a small salute. "That presentation was flawless under impossible circumstances." "Just doing my job," she replied, but the words felt inadequate. They both knew what she'd accomplished went far beyond her job description. "No," he said, his green eyes serious. "That was exceptional. You're exceptional, Ayla. I've been watching your work, your dedication. You remind me of myself when I was building this company. Except you're better at it than I ever was." The compliment hit her harder than it should have. In 5 years at Blackstone, he'd never called her by her first name, never acknowledged her contributions beyond the standard professional courtesies. Hearing him say she was exceptional felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. Lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by thunder that shook the building. The lights went out completely, leaving them in the flickering glow of the fireplace and emergency lanterns. "Well," Nathaniel said with the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him, "looks like we're really stuck now, in the warm, intimate darkness, with the storm raging outside and whiskey burning in her chest." Ayla felt something shift between them. The careful professional distance they'd maintained for years began to crumble, replaced by something raw and honest and terrifying. She was about to discover that some storms change everything in their path, leaving nothing the same in their wake. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light across Nathaniel's face as he settled into the leather chair across from Ayla. Without the harsh fluorescent office lighting, she could see the fine lines round his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the weariness he carried like armor. "Tell me something," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Why marketing? You could have done anything: law, medicine, run your own company. Yet you chose to work for someone else." The question caught her off guard. In 5 years, their conversations had never ventured beyond campaign strategies and quarterly reports. "Control," she answered honestly, surprising herself. "My mother raised me alone after my father left. I watched her struggle to build something stable, something that couldn't be taken away. Working for an established agency felt safer than striking out on my own." "Safe," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I used to think safety was the most important thing too." The storm outside seemed to wrap around the lodge like a cocoon, creating a world apart from their usual reality. Ayla found herself studying him, really looking at him for the first time. Without his tailored suits and commanding presence in the boardroom, he seemed more human, more accessible. "What changed your mind?" she asked. Nathaniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Emma. She was diagnosed with brain cancer 6 months after we married. The doctors said she had maybe a year, 2 if she was lucky. She lived for 3 more. And every day she chose risk over safety. Skydiving, traveling to places I thought were too dangerous, starting projects she knew she'd never finish." He stood and walked to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "I spent those 3 years trying to protect her, to keep her safe. It drove her crazy. The night before the accident, we had this massive fight. She said I was so afraid of losing her that I'd forgotten how to live with her." Ayla's chest tightened. She could picture it, Nathaniel's need for control, clashing with a dying woman's desperate grab for life. "The phone call earlier," she said softly. "That was about her." He turned back to her, surprise flickering across his features. "You heard that?" "I didn't mean to. I was looking for you to discuss the Morrison timeline." "And Sarah was Emma's sister," he said, cutting off her explanation. "She thinks I've been using work as an excuse to avoid living. Tonight she told me she's getting remarried and moving to Seattle. Emma made her promise to look after me, but Sarah says it's time for both of us to move on." The vulnerability in his admission made Ayla's heart race. This wasn't the cold, calculating CEO she knew. This was a man who'd been hollowed out by grief, hiding behind professional success because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. "She's not wrong," Ayla said carefully, "about the work. I mean, you're here 12 hours a day, every day, even tonight. You were planning to review contracts instead of going back to the city with everyone else. And you," he challenged, moving back toward the fire. "When's the last time you took a real vacation? When's the last time you went on a date that wasn't interrupted by a client emergency?" Heat flushed her cheeks. He was right, and they both knew it. She lived and breathed Blackstone Creative, had sacrificed relationships and personal time for the sake of building something meaningful. "That's different, is it?" He sat down again, leaning forward so their knees almost touched. "We're both hiding, Ayla, both using work to avoid the messy, complicated business of actually living. The whiskey and the intimacy of the moment were making her bold. What would living look like for you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Outside, the storm was beginning to calm, but inside the lodge, something electric was building. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, and she saw heat there. "What?" And something that looked dangerously like hope. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's been so long since I let myself want anything beyond the next quarter's profits or the next client win." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But sitting here with you, watching you save our asses today, like some kind of corporate superhero, I'm starting to remember what it felt like to be impressed by someone, to be attracted to someone." The admission hit her like lightning. She should have been scandalized, should have remembered all the reasons why this was dangerous: the power dynamic, the professional complications, the fact that she'd built her entire career on keeping work and personal life separate. Instead, All she could think about was how his eyes had followed her during the presentation, how he'd looked at her like she was solving puzzles he'd given up on. How right now, in the firelight, he looked at her like she might be the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. "Nathaniel," she said, his name feeling foreign and inanimate on her tongue. "I know," he said, reading the conflict in her voice. "I know all the reasons this is complicated, but Emma used to say that life is too short for safe choices." He reached out, his fingertips barely grazing her hand. "What do you want, Ayla? Not what's smart or professional or safe. What do you actually want?" The touch sent electricity through her entire body. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not her intimidating boss, but a man who'd been as lonely as she was, who'd been hiding behind work just like she had, who was offering her something real and terrifying and beautiful. "I want to know who you are when you're not being the CEO," she said, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "I want to know what makes you laugh, what keeps you awake at night, what you dream about when you let yourself dream." His smile was soft and genuine, transforming his entire face. "Then ask me," he said simply. "We have all night." By midnight, they'd moved from whiskey to coffee, from opposite chairs to the same couch, sharing stories that neither had told anyone else. Ayla learned that Nathaniel had wanted to be a photographer before business school, that he still kept his old camera in his office desk drawer. He discovered that she wrote poetry in the margins of strategy documents when she was thinking, that she'd turned down 3 job offers from competitors because she believed in what they were building at Blackstone. "Show me," he said when she mentioned the poetry, his voice soft with curiosity. "Absolutely not." She laughed, tucking her legs under her on the couch. "They're terrible. Just random thoughts and observations. I doubt that. You don't do anything halfway, Ayla. I've watched you turn client briefs into art, make consumers fall in love with products they didn't know they needed. Your mind is," he paused, searching for words, "it's beautiful, creative and strategic at the same time." The compliment sent warmth spreading through her chest. No one had ever described her mind as beautiful before. Clever, yes, sharp, certainly, but beautiful suggested something more intimate, more personal. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting from her own vulnerability. "Photography, do you miss it?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, staring into the dying fire. "Every day," Emma used to model for me, not professionally, just candid shots. I have thousands of photos of her laughing, reading, cooking, sleeping. After she died, I couldn't look at them, couldn't touch the camera. It felt like betraying her memory to create something new when I'd lost the most beautiful thing I'd ever captured." The raw pain in his voice made Ayla's heart ache. Without thinking, she reached out and covered his hand with hers. His skin was warm, his fingers long and elegant, artist's hands hiding behind expensive suits and merger documents. "She wouldn't want you to stop creating," Ayla said gently. "No artist would want their death to kill art itself." He turned his hand palm up, threading their fingers together. The simple gesture felt monumental, crossing a line they'd been dancing around all evening. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Single mom, remember? I learned early that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. Sometimes you have to make choices before you feel brave enough to make them." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and in the brief flare of light, Ayla saw something shift in Nathaniel's expression. He was looking at her like she was a riddle he'd finally solved, like she was the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been working on for years. "Ayla," he said, her name a question and a prayer. She knew what he was asking, could feel the electricity between them crackling like the storm outside. This was the moment where they either pulled back, returned to their safe professional distance, or stepped into something that would change everything. "I know this is complicated," she whispered. "I know all the reasons we shouldn't. Tell me to stop," he said, shifting closer on the couch until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Tell me to go to my room and we'll pretend this never happened. We'll go back to New York and be professional colleagues who never talk about anything deeper than quarterly projections." But she couldn't say the words, didn't want to say them, because sitting here with him, seeing the man behind the CEO mask, she realized she'd been half alive for years, playing it safe, keeping her heart locked away, convinced that professional success was enough. I can't, she breathed. I don't want to pretend anymore. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. Everything changes. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Maybe everything needs to change. When he kissed her, it was nothing like she'd imagined, not rushed or desperate, but slow and thorough, like he was memorizing the taste of her. His lips were soft, his touch reverent, as if she were something precious he'd been afraid he'd never find. The kiss deepened, and Ayla felt years of careful control dissolving. She'd spent so long being the composed professional, the woman who had everything figured out, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone with her entire being. Nathaniel, she whispered against his lips, and he groaned. At the sound of his name, say it again, he murmured, trailing kisses along her jaw to the sensitive spot below her ear. Nathaniel, she repeated, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. They made love on the couch in front of the dying fire, the storm outside providing cover for the storm they created inside. It was intense and tender, passionate and careful, as if they both understood the magnitude of what they were doing. This wasn't just physical, it was to people who'd been hiding behind their professional personas finally showing themselves to each other, vulnerable and real and completely present. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the throw blanket, Ayla's head on Nathaniel's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to normal. His fingers combed through her hair, and she could feel him pressing soft kisses to the top of her head. No regrets? He asked quietly. She lifted her head to look at him, seeing uncertainty in his green eyes despite the intimacy they'd just shared. None, she said firmly. You, never, he said, pulling her up for another kiss. But we need to talk about what happens now. Monday morning, the office, how we handle this. Ayla's stomach clenched. Reality was already creeping back in, bringing with it all the complications they'd temporarily forgotten. We'll figure it out, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. But even as they held each other in the flickering firelight, both of them knew that Sunday night's storm had been the easy part. The real challenge would come when they returned to the world that defined them, by their professional roles, where their newfound connection would be tested by office politics, power dynamics, and the weight of their own fears. Outside, the storm finally broke, leaving behind an eerie calm that felt more ominous than peaceful. Monday morning arrived with brutal clarity. Ayla sat in her car in the Blackstone Creative parking garage, staring at the elevator that would take her back to her normal life, trying to convince herself that everything hadn't changed. But her lips were still tender from Nathaniel's kisses, her body still hummed with the memory of his touch, and she couldn't stop replaying every moment of their night together. She'd left the lodge before dawn, needing space to think, to process what had happened between them. Nathaniel had been sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen, and she'd almost stayed, almost crawled back into bed with him and pretended the outside world didn't exist. Instead, she'd driven back to the city through empty roads, her mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. What did this mean for her career, for their working relationship, for the careful professional reputation she'd spent 5 years building? The elevator dinged, announcing the arrival of another early riser. Ayla quickly gathered her things and headed inside, determined to face whatever came next with the same composure that had gotten her through every other professional challenge. The office was already buzzing with post-retreat energy. The successful Morrison presentation had everyone riding high, and several colleagues stopped by her desk to congratulate her on saving the day. Each compliment felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that her triumph had led to something far more complicated than a client win. At 9:17 a.m., her phone rang. Ayla, could you come to my office, please? Nathaniel's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. The walk to his corner office felt like a death march through the glass walls. She could see him at his desk, looking every inch the composed CEO in his charcoal suit and crisp white shirt. No trace of the vulnerable man who'd shared his deepest fears with her, who'd made love to her with such tender intensity. Close the door, he said without looking up from his computer. The click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud. Ayla remained standing, unsure of the protocol for the situation. Was she supposed to act normal, professional, pretend Saturday night never happened? Sit, Nathaniel said, finally meeting her eyes. His expression was unreadable, the mask firmly back in place. She took the chair across from his desk, the same one she'd occupied hundreds of times for project updates and strategy sessions. But now the space between them felt charged heavy, with unspoken words and the memory of tangled sheets. "We need to discuss what happened," he began, his tone carefully modulated. "I've been thinking about it all weekend, and I believe we need to establish some boundaries moving forward." Ayla's stomach plummeted. This was at the professional rejection she'd been dreading. "Of course," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. "First, I want you to know that Saturday night was significant. For both of us, I think. But we work together, Ayla. I'm your boss, and that creates complexities we can't ignore." "I understand," she said, though she wasn't sure she did. Was he ending things before they started, asking for discretion, firing her? "I've spoken with HR this morning," Nathaniel continued, and Ayla's heart stopped. "There's an opportunity that's come up. Our London office is expanding, and they need someone with your skills to head up their new accounts division. It's a promotion, significant salary increase, your own team." The words hit her like a physical blow. He was shipping her off, getting rid of the complication she represented. The night that had felt so meaningful to her was apparently just an inconvenience to him. "How convenient," she said, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "A problem solved with a transfer to another continent." Nathaniel's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked like pain. "It's not like that, isn't it?" Ayla stood, her hands shaking with a combination of hurt and fury. "Let me guess, you've had time to think, and you've decided that Saturday night was a mistake, an error in judgment brought on by whiskey and proximity. And now you need to clean up the mess by making me disappear." "Ayla, no," she said, her voice rising. "I'm talking now. Do you know what the most pathetic part of this is? I actually thought it meant something. I thought you were different from every other powerful man who takes what he wants and then discards it when it becomes inconvenient." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Nathaniel stood slowly, his own composure fraying around the edges. "You think I'm discarding you?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You think Saturday night meant nothing to me?" "Actions speak louder than words, Nathaniel. And your action is to send me as far away as possible. I'm trying to protect you." The words exploded out of him, his careful control finally snapping. "Do you have any idea what it's like in this industry for women who get involved with their bosses? The whispers, the speculation, the assumption that every success is because you're sleeping your way to the top." His words stopped her cold. She hadn't considered that angle, had been so focused on her own hurt that she'd missed the protective instinct behind his offer. "I've watched brilliant women have their careers destroyed by office relationships," he continued, moving around the desk toward her. "I won't let that happen to you. You're too talented, too important to be reduced to gossip and speculation." "So, you're making the choice for me," Ayla demanded, "deciding what's best for my career without bothering to ask what I want, what you want." Nathaniel stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the exhaustion in his eyes. "Tell me what you want, Ayla, because I sure as hell don't know anymore." The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Ayla could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that her answer would determine not just their relationship, but the entire trajectory of her future. "I want to fight for this," she said quietly. "I want to figure out how to make it work instead of running away at the first sign of complication. And I want you to trust me enough to let me make my own choices about my career and my life." Nathaniel's eyes searched her face, looking for doubt, for hesitation. When he found none, something shifted in his expression. "The London offer is real," he said carefully. "It's a good opportunity, and it's yours if you want it. But if you stay—" He paused, as if the next words were being torn from him. "If you stay, we'll figure out how to do this right together." Relief flooded through Ayla, followed quickly by a new kind of fear. They were really going to try this, despite all the complications and potential consequences. "I'm staying," she said firmly. But we do this as equals, Nathaniel. No more making decisions about my life without consulting me. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him all morning. Understood. Partners, partners, she agreed, and sealed the deal with a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises, and the kind of risk that might just be worth everything. 3 months later, Ayla stood in the Blackstone creative lobby, watching the controlled chaos of their biggest launch event ever. The Morrison campaign had exceeded all expectations, leading to 3 more major accounts and the kind of industry recognition that transformed agencies from successful to legendary. She'd kept her word about staying, and somehow, against all odds, she and Nathaniel had made it work. It hadn't been easy. There were awkward moments when colleagues sensed something different between them, careful navigation of office dynamics, and long conversations about boundaries and expectations. But they'd learned to be partners in every sense of the word, building something stronger than either had imagined possible. Admiring your handiwork, Nathaniel appeared beside her, looking impossibly handsome in his tuxedo. The formal event was their first public appearance as a couple. They'd decided it was time to stop hiding our handiwork, she corrected, adjusting his bow tie with the casual intimacy that had developed between them. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Funny, he said, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. I was about to say the same thing about you. The gesture drew a few glances from nearby colleagues, and Ayla felt the familiar flutter of nerves. They'd been careful to maintain professionalism in the office, but being open about their relationship still felt vulnerable, exposed. As if reading her thoughts, Nathaniel squeezed her hand. Second thoughts, never, she said, meaning it completely. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous about the gossip mill. Let them talk, he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. What we have is real, Ayla, built on respect and partnership and something deeper than office politics. Anyone who matters will see that. He was right, she realized. In the months since the lodge, they'd proven that their relationship made them both better at work and in life. Nathaniel had started taking weekends off, had even pulled out his old camera and begun photographing again. Ayla had found herself taking risks she'd never considered before, trusting her instincts in ways that had elevated not just her own work, but the entire creative team. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC's voice boomed across the room. Please welcome the dynamic duo behind this year's most innovative campaign, Creative Director Ayla Morgan and CEO Nathaniel Blake. They walked onto the small stage together, and Ayla felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them. But instead of the judgment she'd feared, she saw respect, admiration, and yes, some curiosity about their obvious chemistry. Nathaniel stepped to the microphone first. When we started this campaign, we knew we were taking risks. The Morrison account represented a new direction for Blackstone Creative, a chance to push boundaries and create something truly innovative. But the biggest risk and the best decision was trusting our team to bring their whole selves to the work. He turned to look at Ayla, his eyes warm with pride and something deeper. My partner in this venture taught me that the most powerful creative work comes from authenticity, from the courage to be vulnerable and real. She saved this campaign, this company, and he paused, his voice catching slightly. She saved me too. The room was silent, hanging on every word. Ayla felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what he was doing, not just acknowledging her professional contributions, but publicly claiming their relationship as something worth celebrating. She stepped to the microphone, her voice strong and clear. They say you should never mix business with pleasure, but I've learned that the best partnerships happen when you bring your whole heart to everything you do. Nathaniel Blake is the most brilliant strategist I've ever worked with, but more than that, he's the person who taught me that taking risks in work and in life is the only way to create something truly extraordinary. The applause was thunderous, and as they left the stage together, Ayla felt lighter than she had in years. They'd done it, navigated the professional complications, weathered the gossip, and emerged stronger on the other side. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Nathaniel found her on the building's rooftop terrace, looking out over the city lights. Hiding from your adoring public, he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Just thinking," she said, leaning back against his chest, "about that night at the lodge. About everything that's happened since. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd played it safe? If I'd taken the London transfer, if we'd pretended?" That night never happened. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his chin resting on top of her head. "I think we would have spent the rest of our lives wondering what if." Emma used to say that regret was heavier than risk, and she was right. The scariest thing isn't taking a chance on something real, it's living with the knowledge that you were too afraid to try. Ayla turned in his arms, studying his face in the soft light from the city below. "No regrets, only one," he said, his smile teasing. "I regret waiting so long to tell you how I felt. I regret all those years of thinking professional success was enough, when what I really needed was someone who challenged me to be better at everything." "Better late than never," she murmured, rising on her toes to kiss him. As they held each other under the stars, surrounded by the evidence of their professional triumph and personal happiness, Ayla marveled at how one storm-filled night had changed the trajectory of both their lives. They'd risked everything: careers, reputations, their carefully constructed professional identities, and found something neither had expected. A partnership that made them both more than they'd ever been alone. The city sparkled beneath them, full of possibilities and new beginnings, and for the first time in her life, Ayla wasn't afraid of what came next. Epilogue question: when you witness a couple like Ayla and Nathaniel, to professionals who found love despite workplace power, dynamics and industry pressures, do you believe it's possible to maintain both professional integrity and personal authenticity in today's corporate world? Or are such relationships ultimately too risky to navigate successfully? What would you have done in their situation?